another DraftScience video presentation. This is part 3 in the Feynman, whatever you want to call it, the inspection of the quality of the physics taught to the human race, as well as in the institutions of higher learning. They don't do any better, really. It's pretty much the same lecture, just a little bit more math. And yeah, it's just, it's contrived. Just like all the experiments, they spend a lot of money on equipment, air tracks and this and that, and all they do is the same standard experiments. They don't innovate at all. They don't try something new. They don't push the experiment a little, see what else they can discover. So a lot of equipment wasted in these institutions, because it's really just about talking about the Bible. It's not about exploring a better truth or finding a better truth or a different truth. It's just about reinforce the propaganda. And it is fundamentally propaganda because it's fundamentally flawed. It's based on a lot of false premises. They might as well just be painting little horns on things to pretend to, photograph them with watermelons or do whatever they can to create this very false impression of what particles can do or what waves can do or what anything else can do besides their wooey conclusions. So in the first couple of parts I explained how his description of particles is vacuous. I mean, he's given them no features. We know they have to have a frequency. Frequency is hugely important to the outcome. No frequency. And then he explored waves and again just really didn't point out fundamental distinctions where whatever these ether waves would be, they would have to be in some ways fundamentally different from ocean waves, in that light doesn't turn on and off. The pattern doesn't get higher and lower, where the photons are and things like that. So, but it's all for some storytelling, in the sense that, look, all these mechanical ways for it to work don't work. And the only explanation is there's a woo force that woos the work, there's woo forces that are wooing, the mechanical system. That's the story he wants to tell. That's the story he wants to convince you of. And in my opinion, he's done it by cheating the facts all over the place. It's just the fact. It's just the truth. So here he's going to begin his nothing but the woo could possibly explain this.
Now nobody, the question is, how can that come about? When they go through hole 1, they would be distributed this way. When they go through hole 2, they would be distributed that way.
Alright, so we already know that's wrong. Okay, that's only an artifact of the drawing. You can't draw it to scale. The slits are tiny, 1 millimeter. The projecting surface is gigantic in terms of the distance it is away, and there is no reasoning that supports any theory that the light comes out of the slits like this. It doesn't do that. It's not coming out at an angle because the source isn't right up next to the slit. It's not coming out at angles. It's coming straight out like headlights, and the headlights don't get further apart with distance. And so these two humps are really right on top of each other, and just a tiny millimeter of difference between them. So covering a slit wouldn't create a pattern you could see as noticeably different. It wouldn't be noticeably in a different location. So again, a simple geometric flaw in his reasoning. I mean, it's simple geometry, and he's broken it.
How can it be that when both holes are open, you don't get the sum of the two? Instant.
So, in a sense, you do get the sum of the two, and the two is actually 4. So the math that works says there's 4 sources. And the fact is the pattern you're getting is a combination of the fact that all 4 sources are in phase. And the places where you don't have light, you're short a couple of sources. So the light is dim enough that if you just have the one pattern, it's very, very faint. If you have just the other pattern, the other slit, it's very, very faint. And it's only when you combine the two that you multiply the potential to put pieces together. So the more sources means the more potential to roll the number. If I have a dice with just 2 ones on it, you know, it's harder to roll 2 than if I have 2 dice with 2 ones on it. I magnify, I amplify, I quadruple the possibility of matches if I have more sources.
If I hold the detector at this point here, I get practically nothing.
So this is the part where he's going to say there's an experiment, they did this, they've proven it, it's established, when no, it isn't. So the idea is you cover a slit, and the idea is I get practically nothing at a location. And then I open the other slit, and the inverse really. There's light, and then there's not light. Let me finish letting him say it.
If I close one of the holes, I get plenty.
Okay, see, so again, he's still using the same this distorted view. So we know the two are right on top of each other, and you can't use that argument. There's a certain amount of light that gets through if one slit is open. There's going to be a single slit pattern, and the single slit pattern is going to be projected on the wall. So this is another part of the experiment he's completely ignored, is that the double slit is really 2 single slit experiments put right next to each other. So they're still creating pattern individually. They don't create that hump anyway. So even the hump itself is a deception, because the logic is, the inescapable logic is, you can't make a single slit that doesn't create the pattern, some kind of pattern. So, you know, we're already in big trouble because they're not even establishing that the single slit makes a pattern, and then they've put the pattern in the wrong place.
If I close the other hole, I get something. If I leave both holes open, I get nothing.
Okay, so he didn't point to anything when he said I get nothing, because it'd have to be at a location. And the fact is, you don't get nothing. But the truth is that places that were a little bit light stay a little bit lit. And the places that get lit, because now you have 4 sources. See, you add a fourth source. Say you add 3 sources, you have a match between this one, and this one. You know, you can match this one with this one, this one. If I add another source, I can match with this one, or this one. You see, it multiplies. Every source multiplies with every single pairing, so you can amplify the number of matches. So with one slit open, you only have 2 sources, and with the other slit open, you only have 2 sources. But when you combine them, you have a lot of combinations. So it's not that something gets darker when you open the slit. It's that the brights get much brighter. So the places where there is a phase match get really bright. So the places that look like an on before now look like an off, just because they're not nearly as bright.
If I let them go through both holes, I don't come anymore. Or take the point in the center. You can show.
Like I said, now if that was a true statement, it would be profound. Okay, the idea that light plus light equals no light. That would be a profound truth if they could truly illustrate or truly prove it. But they can't, because when they attempt to do those type experiments, they have to finagle them to get the result. They can't do it straight up.
Oh, that's higher than the sum than it was in the other case, than the sum of these 2. I get more here when both holes are open than I would get with either one of the 2 closed.
Now, the fact that you get more, again, is the fact that there are sources, and obviously when you add more sources, you add more potential to get more light. So, yes, it's perfectly consistent with what would happen if you understand there's 4 point sources.
Now, you might think that if you were clever enough, you could argue that they have some way of going around through the holes back and forth, and they do something complicated, or it splits in half and goes through the 2 holes.
Alright, so here he's mocking the idea and essentially just saying, we thought of all of those. So there's no possible explanation. So the idea would be, is clearly, as I pointed out, they gave particles no character. But if we established ahead of time that we're firing bullets that have a frequency, so that means there's 3 bullets as a minimum, and they have a certain distance between them. So we're shooting the bullets in with a frequency between the bullets, and what we're trying to find is a pattern on the wall where the sequence of landing of a bullet matches that sequence. That is, it's 3 milliseconds between the bullets, and you end up hitting the target with bullets that hit at 3 milliseconds between the bullets. So it's that simple change, no convoluted going in and out of slits, none of that stuff has to happen now. With that simple explanation, you could understand that these surfaces are all going to interact with bullets, and pieces of photons are going to get broken, and you're going to have pieces flying to the surface from different patterns, and the different photon patterns can recreate the same pattern because they will have path length differences that are puts them exactly back in sequence again, puts them exactly back in the right order. And so you will get locations on the target where you take the broken pieces of many photons, 4 at least, and you put them back in the right sequence. You have a 50-50 chance. It's the simple truth. So you will create a lot of photons on the target that are made out of those broken pieces. And the other truth we know, that these patterns are all on top of each other, and that it's one pattern. All of the fringes are actually being created from photons coming from the surfaces. None of the fringe pattern is made from photons that go through the middle of the openings. Those are the ones going straight through.
And so forth, in order to explain this phenomenon. Nobody, however, has succeeded to get...
So again, we're just saying because nobody thought of it, and the truth is nobody really tried very hard, as illustrated by Feynman himself. So Feynman himself is kind of ignorant, not only that there is a single slit pattern, that there's a difference between the single slit and the double slit pattern, in the sense the double slit pattern has 2 patterns in it, completely says nothing about any of those features, just draws a squiggly line, on, off, on, off. It's more complicated than just on, off, on, off. So he's ignored fundamental features of it, paid no attention to them, the 2 lump thing. I mean, all of that is all showing some kind of ignorance, that the real structure is more complicated than that. And then you're surprised that they haven't thought of it. Well, of course they haven't thought of it, because they didn't even wish to fully understand how it works. They never really sat there with it and said mechanically, drew lines and said, let's figure out how this works. They didn't do that. And yet they're saying it as if nobody could figure it out. It's impossible to figure out. There's no possible explanation. I would argue they didn't even spend a day on it. Okay, they didn't spend one day trying to figure it out. Because if they did, they would have looked at the Young drawing and they would have said, this doesn't even mathematically work. So they would have known that Young is an outline for an idea. It's some sort of test of theory, but it's not a proof, because it doesn't get the right answer. But they didn't do any of that. And yet he's going to talk as if they did do this work and they couldn't find the answer because they went through it all and they picked it to pieces. None of them picked it to pieces. They barely thought about it as an experiment.
An explanation of this that's satisfactory, because the mathematics in the end is so very simple. The curve is so very simple.
Well, that's not the reason, of course. The fact that it's simple should be sort of a giveaway. Again, they don't even realize that the only places that the fringes can be made from are the point sources. That's what their simple math proves. Their simple math proves there's point sources creating the fringes. And you can't put the point source in the middle of the fringe and get the right geometry to create the pattern. You have to put the point sources on the surfaces. That's the math that works. So that simple statement in the math should be telling you, well, did I think about surfaces and what they might do to a photon? What's special about a surface? Oh, that's right, it has atoms. What is special about atoms? Well, atoms have electrons. What's special about electrons? Well, they're the thing that interacts with photons more than anything else. The whole reason why it's called quantum electrodynamics is because of the fact that the whole theory is based mostly on the interaction between photons and electrons. That's essentially what the subject is. The subject is quantum electron-photon interaction. They could have called it that, and it would have been a more accurate name for what quantum electrodynamics is. It's all about photons hitting electrons, creating electricity. That's the essential function. So, again, I'm not giving you any, like, oh, this was a really hard truth to reveal. No, this is a really easy truth to see. And they just didn't look for it. They were happy with the wacky answer. You know, the UFO theory is the one they jumped on, and they didn't care the photograph is fuzzy. They didn't care that the photograph was made by somebody who didn't pay any attention to how to make a photograph, right? He had a really cruddy dark room. You know, they just don't care about the details. That if you look all at them, you'll see that this is an incredible fable, not a credible fable.
I will summarize then by saying that electrons arrive in lumps.
So now he's talking about electrons. So clearly before he was talking about photons, now he's talking about electrons. The electron experiment has no resemblance to this experiment at all. Completely different. The electrons are aimed, tiny spaces. This is all done inside of an electron microscope. Completely different experiment. Really shouldn't be part of the conversation. Stick to one subject, Richard. Mixing experiments that don't have any physical similarity is really cheating an argument.
Like pot. But the probability of arrival of these lumps is determined like the intensity of waves would be. And it is in this sense that the electron behaves, as you might say, sometimes like a particle and sometimes like a wave. It behaves in these two different ways at the same time.
Well, it can't do it at the same time, so you should at least say it's doing it at different times. Sometimes it's a wave and sometimes it's particles. But obviously the duality is nonsense. It's any scientist would say it's not both a Tyrannosaurus and a Brontosaurus. I mean, they know the bone has to go with one or the other. So this should be totally unsatisfactory as a scientific answer to say it's both wet and it's dry. I mean, it's just not anywhere close to getting a right answer.
And that's all there is to say. I give a mathematical description to figure out the probability of arrival.
So the mathematical description really says absolutely nothing that you don't already know. So you put the observed probability in, and it gives you the answer. So you figure out the roulette wheel has 32 numbers on it, or whatever it is, and then you just do the math to figure out what the odds are of any one number coming up based on the fact that there's 32 possibilities, and blah blah blah. So the math is just nothing. And again, the geometric math using the theory of wave mechanics, that geometry math works. But it works only if you consider the single slit the two-source experiment, and you consider, or the single impediment, the two-source experiment, and the double slit is the four-source experiment. So if you consider there to be four sources, the math works. All right, but it's just geometry, and it doesn't necessitate the existence of waves. It just necessitates the existence of a frequency. And as pointed out, bullets can be shot at a frequency, and there is nothing about them that is technically wave-like. There's no reason to say bullets are waving. They're at a period. They're at a distance. They don't have a wavelength, okay? They have a distance between each other. Okay, so, but they're no way a wave. There's no medium that's making the bullets travel.
Electrons under any circumstances and so on, and that would, in principle, be the end of the lecture, except that there are a number of subtleties involved in the fact that nature works this way.
Okay, so he's set up the premise that, wow, nature's really wacky, and therefore we have to come up with a wacky theory that we can somehow make consistent in terms of this wackiness goes all the way down or all the way up, or now we're going to get into a wacky decision. What's the implications of the fact that I've proven UFOs exist? That's essentially what he's doing when he clearly hasn't proven UFOs exist.
There's a number of peculiar things, and I would like to discuss those peculiarities because they may not be self-evident at this point. So it doesn't.
Yeah, so none of it's self-evident beyond the fact that there's a pattern and it looks like. So all we have is pattern, looks like, and we don't have the science stopped pretty much there. Pattern, looks like, the end. When, no, you got to go a little deeper.
We begin by discussing a proposition which we would have thought to use since these things are lumps. Since what comes is always one complete, which I'll call an electron. One complete lump, one...
Okay, so again, he says the same rules for electrons, photons. He keeps saying electron. The electron experiment isn't done this way, so why say electron? Blah, blah, blah. So he's again doing this lump thing, and the fact is the lump is just the pattern. So there's absolutely no reason to believe a photon is a clump. There's every reason to believe to give the particle theory any possibility of matching the physical results. You have to give the particles a frequency. You have to give them the character that makes it possible for them to be a photon. And by simply doing that, by saying photon is this, all right, that's the right answer. Now they did this with electrons and protons, right? They decided that protons were made out of quarks, and then quarks did this and that and the other thing, and their jaws didn't drop off or whatever. They didn't drop dead, or nothing tragic happened. But they won't ever indulge in any conversation recognizing that a photon might be a composite object, and that would be the nature of its frequency. Even if you believed in a wave theory, you'd have to concede that the waves, one lump can't show up and say, this is my frequency. That's pretty impractical. That, to get the frequency, you'd have to have more than one wave show up to really measure a frequency. So that's a huge glaring avenue of speculation for which they have not opened the door and have in some ways said don't go there.
Big electron. It's obvious that it's reasonable that either an electron arrives or goes, let's say, that either an electron goes through hole number one.
So that's all just based on the fact that they've narrowed this to a solid photon, and that all you're going to say is the solid photon did something. It went somewhere. Clearly, the argument can be made that if there's two slits, that these three batteries could go through and this one could be lost in the process. And on the other slit, these two could be lost in the process, and this one still remains. And all you're doing is on the screen putting those two pieces, those two sequences back together, and now you have a photon again. So you're taking one from one surface and two from another surface, and you're combining them at a location back in the proper frequency. That simple explanation does solve the problem. So you can't say it's unsolvable. You can't say this is an overt fact. The photon has to go through one slit or has to go through the other slit. Because if your theory is breaking and reconstruction instead of interference, which a lot of other evidence supports, like the radar experiment and other experiments, support the theory. In the radar experiments, the pattern's created by jamming. The energy still is getting to the surface. So again, they haven't done the experiment where they measure the heat at each location and see whether the same amount of energy is actually hitting all locations on the screen. Some of it just might not be in a form we call photon, but it's still energy. The pieces are still getting there, they're just not in the right order.
Or it goes through hole number two. That seems like it.
So he's saying that's obvious and established and that's a fact. So that's closing the door, right? That's essentially, whoops, we've drawn a conclusion that may not be true. So he's written it on the blackboard, in stonish, and whoops, that could be a mistake. Because you never proved that. Okay. You never established that as the only option.
That seems very obvious that it can't do anything else if it's a lump.
So he did it again. Okay. So again, if it's a lump, and again, well, we know lumps are often made out of lumpettes. Okay, so it's not a big stretch to say, well, what if the lump is made of lumpettes?
And I'm going to discuss this proposition, so I have to give it a name. I'll call it Proposition A. Now, we've already discussed a little bit what happens with Proposition A. If it were true that an electron either goes through hole number 1 or it goes through hole number 2, then the total number which arrive here would have to be analyzable as a sum of two contributions. The total number which arrive here will be the number that come here via hole 1 plus the number that come via hole 2. And since this curve cannot easily be analyzed as a sum of two pieces in such a nice manner, and since the experiments which determine how many would have arrived would have arrived, if only hole number 1 were open, don't give the result that this number is the sum of these two, it is obvious that we should conclude that this proposition is false. It is not true that the electron...
Okay, so he says it's true, then he says it's not true, but clearly they believe it's true, because that's the whole reason the two slits exist, is because obviously it's creating two new entities, two wave functions, whatever. So now the argument isn't going to go, it either goes through hole 1 or it goes through hole 2. The argument is it goes through both holes. So it gets more so they double down on silly, essentially.
On either comes through hole number 1 or hole number 2. Maybe it divides itself in half temporarily and so on. So proposition A is false. That's logic. Unfortunately, or otherwise, we can test logic by experiment.
So again, it wouldn't make much sense for him to argue that the clump doesn't go through either hole and it lands at the surface. So you could just prove the opposite as being impossible also, is the argument. Well, it has to go through something because it can't get to the other surface without going through something. So the choice is either it goes through one hole or the other hole, or it goes through both holes, or... oh yeah, there isn't any other choice.
So we just have to do to find out whether it's true or not that the electrons come through hole 1 and hole 2, or maybe they go around through both holes and they split up and so. We don't have to do. All we have to do is watch them.
So this is the part where it really gets silly, because we can't watch photons and we can't watch electrons for that matter. Can't do it. There's no medium to use to measure them. You can't flash a light at them. You can't, even if you could flash lights at photons, we already know photons don't care. So they're invisible to light. They're not bent by light. They're not affected by light. And electrons are clearly affected dramatically. That's why you call it quantum electrodynamics, because the whole argument is a single photon hits an electron and the electron goes all wacky. So you know you can't measure it with that. You can't see it. You can measure it, but in the process of measuring, you completely change where it's going to go. So you can't passively watch it. It's like you just have, all you have is a gun, and all you can do is shoot the thing. You can't do anything else. There's no passive way to know of its existence.
Watching, we need light. So we put back here behind the holes a source of light, very intense light.
So this is just a thought experiment. This is not an experiment that was actually done, that actually got results. But he's going to talk about it like it's a real experiment, and that they really did it, and they really proved something. So it's just part of making the fable seem more realistic, is by telling stories about other UFOs that landed, or show some other pictures of, cigars. And that's all it is.
Light is scattered by electrons and bounced off electrons. And in other words, you can see electrons if they go by if the light's strong enough. So we stand back here.
But you can't do it and leave the electron alone. So the point is the photon, a single photon, has way too much energy to interact with a single electron. And the truth is, their own theory of electrons and photons is really messed up, because photons have a gigantic polarization. The size that they go through in space is gigantic, and electrons are really, really tiny, pinhead kind of things, really pinpoint kind of things, very, 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 very tiny. So obviously something a million times or something 1,000 times bigger than the electron, at least. I mean, the photon is actually 1,000 times bigger than an atom, a whole atom. So you can imagine whatever the electron is as a tiny contribution to the whole atom. So how could something that's 1,000 times bigger than an atom interact with one single electron? There's just no practical way you can make that make any sense. So clearly, clumpettes, the pieces of a photon, interact with electrons, and interact in a sense that they give one electron a stimulus. That stimulus is transferred through other electrons, and then another piece of the photon hits and gives the electron more momentum. So the process of creating electricity is what photons do, and that process isn't something that happens to one single electron. Now, one single electron can scatter photons because it takes the individual pieces of the photon and sends them in different directions. And again, now we're just back to the reconstruction argument. If it sends them to the same direction, two pieces from two different locations, you'll reconstruct the pattern. So scatter isn't really scattering a whole photon, it's scattering the constituents of the photon, and then you reconstruct a photon at some location forward of that.
And we look to see whether we see, when the electron is counted here, a flash, or have seen the moments before the electron is counted, a flash behind hole 1 or a flash behind hole 2, or maybe a sort of a half flash in each place at the same time.
So he knows theoretically this is impossible. He is a nuclear physicist. He knows that. He knows he should just tell the audience it's theoretically impossible to view either an electron or a photon. I'm just giving you some idea about how we might be able to prove something. But he's talking about it as if this is actually a proof, as if they actually did the experiment. And that's the part that makes this so dishonest and so deceptive. That he wasn't fair to his audience, and in telling them, no, this experiment was never done because it's theoretically impossible to do it. I can't even make these detectors small enough. In the electron experiment, the detector would have to be mere atoms of size. It would have to be so small to even fit in the experiment. The experiment is 1,000 times smaller than the light experiment. The slits are 1,000 times smaller. How could you possibly put a detector in between the slits? How could you? There's no possibility of doing anything so ludicrous. And again, he knows you can't shoot photons at electrons without moving them, changing their path. So this whole thing is just, what other purpose does this have than to deceive? This isn't how you tell people the truth, by telling stories that will imply you did something that was never done, that you did actually prove something. So, I'm just saying, you're going to make icons out of people who play these kind of games with science. And that's, I think, a terrible tragedy, because this is a game he's playing. He knows better. He knows it didn't happen that way. He knows this isn't a proof. And I think he also obviously knows that he's implying it is a proof.
Because we're going to find out now how it goes by looking. Well, you turn on the light and look. And lo, you discover that you see flashes behind either one hole or the other hole every time you get a count here. Every time there's a count here, you see a flash behind number 1 or behind number 2. What you see is that the electron comes 100% complete through hole 1 or through hole 2. When you look. Kind of a paradox.
Okay, so he's talking about how, wow, that experiment really is confusing, isn't it? Whoa, boy, that really, whoa, I've proved that it goes through one hole or the other hole because I just told you it doesn't do that, but the experiment proves it does that. Woo, 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 woo. There's no experiment.
Well, let's make it some kind of a difficult. I'll show you what we're going to do, see? We're going to keep the light on, we're going to watch. And you're going to count, we're going to count how many electrons come through. And we're going to make 2 columns.
So again, this is the theater of it. He's indicating out now that this is so simple, even a kid could do it. You know, all we're going to do is put up a little chart and count photons, and this would be so easy, and this is no big deal, and we've done this all the time because it's so easy. No.
I'll watch the holes very carefully while you please count how many are arriving in the detector. All right, you say, one arrived. I said, I saw that when it went through hole number 1. Well, we put here 2 columns, which is column 1 for number 1 hole and number 2 hole. And every time you get one, you tell me you got one. I have seen it, of course, and I say either number 1 or 2. The first one was 1. What's the next one? Number 2. All right. Number 2. Number 2. Number 1. So on. So as we watch the...
I mean, see, this is just part of the theater, right? This is just part of the show, okay? The medicine show. See, I can cure your disease. Cancer's nothing. Cancer, you know, it starts with a C. All I got to do is make like a D thing, and the D will kill the C, and you're done. You're cured. So let's just call whatever I call this jar of crap, well, it's called D. And next day, I'm going to make some E stuff. E is a lot more stronger, okay? E totally annihilates C's. You know, it's just some sort of shtick. Okay, this isn't science in any way. This is what propaganda looks like. Let's engage the audience in, you know, the Nazis probably had little games. Whack the Jew. You know, you go play the game. You know, you go to the amusement park. You know, and throw things at the little horned Jew thing. You know, this is all just, I'm going to sell you on this bullshit, and this is part of the fun. Let's have fun with it. It's science. And what it is really religion. So this is just like playing Jesus bingo. You know, where the bingo card has little Jesuses on it, and little demons, and little, you know, hobgoblins, and all the little, Holy Ghosts. You know, and you have to match your one Holy Ghost. B, Holy Ghost, C, Holy Ghost, you know.
Electrons, as I watch the electrons, for every one that you count, I can separate them experimentally into 2 columns. And them are what have arrived via hole 1, and those, I know the English is right, I'm just trying to, that arrived via hole 2. So the total number that arrived, well, first, what does this column look like when you add it all together for different positions here, which is just the number that's supposed to come through 1. I watch behind 1, and what do I see? I see this curve. That column is distributed this way.
So again, we know those 2 curves are a millimeter apart, not 72 inches, okay? Those 2 lumps are right in exactly the same location almost. It's so close that you wouldn't be able to see the difference. Realistically, it's like me putting 2 batteries behind each other, and you looking at it from 5 feet away and figuring out, oh, this one's a tiny bit more than that one. You wouldn't be able to see it. No chance.
Just like we thought when we closed hole 2. Works the same way whether we're looking or not. If we close hole 2, the same distribution in those that arrive as if we are watching. And likewise, the number in this column.
Okay, so he just told us what the outcome was when there is no experiment. So he said, okay, if we watch the electrons, we hit them with photons, the electrons that we see go to a certain location. Now we know they can't do that because when we hit them with the photon, we changed where they went. So they can't create that pattern. So in whatever direction we're hitting the electrons from, right, the light source, obviously all the electrons will go in that direction. So whatever it is, we know we shot the pattern way over there. We're pushing it with the photons. So I mean, this is denying so much elemental physics that you're saying, what's the purpose of this? It's such a canard. It's so disconnected from the physics he knows. What's its purpose but to create a simplistic, pigeonholey, scapegoaty, straw man-y kind of thing. He's just creating a fake notion of the reality to support the theory.
That is supposed to arrive via hole number 2 is also a simple curve. Now look, the total number which arrives has to be the total number. I'm just counting little marks. It has to be the sum of this number plus that number. The total number which arrives absolutely has to be the sum of these two. It has to be distributed this way. When I said it was distributed this way, it's distributed this way. It really is, but it has to be. It is distributed this way.
So again, he said it again as if they did the experiment. He's just using a thought experiment to say, no, there's no pattern when we do the experiment because I've changed the electron and it can't make the pattern, so it goes back to its normal pattern. But there's no reason to think it goes back to its normal pattern either. You creating a new pattern. So by influencing the electron, you would just be creating some new pattern. You wouldn't be creating the original no interference pattern, and you can't create the interference pattern because you've double interfered now. You've created another interference. So you wouldn't be creating either one of those patterns. You'd be creating some third pattern. That would be the simple statement, the simple answer. And that whole exercise would be totally irrelevant because you learn absolutely nothing from it. But that's not how he described it.
If then we mark with a prime the results when a light is lit, prime means with a light lit, then we find N1 prime is practically the same as N1 without the light, and N2 prime is almost the same as N2.
So he's saying it looks just like the original, the pattern without any interference, just with one of the slits open. And again, I'll point out, well, we already know that when one slit is open, a pattern is created, the single slit pattern. So it's not going to be any of this. So all of this is so distant from the actual truth that you could say, well, what's the justification for telling the story this abstract? Why are you putting 3 pigs in the story? Why are you putting fairy god birds? Why are you creating all of these fake entities in this story? Why can't you just tell the truth?
Number that we see when the light is on is equal to the number that we see through 1 plus the number that we see through 2. This is the result that we get when the light is on. In other words, we get a different answer whether I turn on the light or not. If I have the light turned on, this is the distribution which you measure over here. If I turn off the light.
So clearly we all know that that would probably be in some sense true, and it's true for an obvious reason, that you've basically kicked the electron right out of the experiment. Your light on means I kick the electron right out of the experiment. Boom, boom, gone. So obviously I can't make the complex pattern, and I'm not going to make the simple pattern either, but I'm certainly not going to make the complex pattern because the electron isn't even in the experiment anymore.
This is the distribution that you measure over here. Turn on the light, this is the answer. Turn off the light, that's the answer. See, they just squeezed out.
So again, now he's making this into some kind of unexplainable reality that must be explained, and it's not real. If you can see the obvious. He's implied this is a real phenomenon when no, it's just bullshit. It's just kind of a completely fake idea. It's something to think about as an abstraction. But it has nothing. This isn't real. This isn't a real conundrum.
We could say then that the light affects the result.
There.
If the light is on, you get a different answer than if the light is off. If you want to, you can say the light affects, it does affect. In fact, we found this by this experiment. We get a difference with the light on and off. Light affects the...
We found from this experiment. So we know that that's just a lie. They never did this experiment. They've tried to shoot light at electrons and they find they move the electron. So and we clearly know we can't see a photon and have no chance at all. So, it wasn't this experiment though that showed that. So again, he's implying they did the experiment, which is just nobody could physically do it. You can't make the instrument small enough to do it with electrons, and you have no hope with photons. Photons are impossible to passively view.
Behavior of electrons. If you want to talk about the motion of the electrons through here, which is a little inaccurate, you can say that the light affects the motion, so that those which might have arrived at the maximum are somehow been deviated or kicked by the light and arrive at the minimum instead, thus smoothing the curve to produce this thing. You see, electrons are very delicate. Although when you're looking at a base...
Right. So he's basically conceding part of the counter argument that why are we even talking about this? Because, yeah, that's exactly what the reasoning. I move the electron. Perfectly valid explanation for why the pattern's not there anymore.
And you shine light on it, doesn't make any difference. The baseball goes the same way. Electrons are very flimsy, very delicate. And when you shine the light on them, a little tough on the electron, it knocks them about a bit. And instead of doing that, they do this, because you turn the light on so strong. You hit them with a hammer. It's not just a delicate thing like when you're looking at a baseball with light. They are hit them with a hammer. But you turn up the light too strong. Turn it weaker and weaker and weaker until it's very dim. And use very careful detectors.
Okay, so again, the implication is, so what we really do know about photons is the thing they are made out of, the constituent stuff, that is extremely tiny in terms of its momentum. So it is really delicate. But the photon itself is huge. So that's the part they've never fully put that into their brain and said, oh, let's work with that model and see what the outcome is. So he's going to keep saying, I have to hit the electron with a whole photon. No, you're just hitting it with one piece of the photon. And even one piece of a photon moves the electron. And that's what makes the whole process hopeless.
Very dim light. And look, with the dim light, now as the light gets dimmer and dimmer, you can't expect with very, very, very weak light.
So even with the bright light, the only thing hitting the electron is the constituent of the photons. So it really makes no difference how bright the light is, because the one piece, the one quanta of a photon moves the electron. So you can't get any dimmer or less bright or weaker. You're always hitting it with something that will decisively change its path. There's no weak constituent part to a photon. They're quantized. They're all the same energy. So you can't weaken the impact.
To affect the electron so completely is to change the pattern 100% from this pattern to this pattern. As the light gets weaker and weaker and weaker, somehow it should get more and more like no light at all. And how then does this turn into that? It turns out that light is not like a wave of water, but light also comes in particle-like character called photons. And as you turn down the intensity of the light, you're not turning down the effect, you're turning down the number of photon particle-like things that are coming out.
All right, so again, it's not photon particle-like things. It's pieces of momentum at a frequency. That's the photon. These things are the stuff that hits the electron. These things are the things that carry the momentum. This thing carries the identity. So a photon is this, or some other arrangement, out of frequency, is heat, is some other form of energy. But it's still going to move an electron.
So as I turn down the light, I'm getting fewer and fewer photons. The least I can scatter from an electron is one photon, and if I have too few photons, well, sometimes the electron would get through, and it just happened, there wasn't enough light, there was no photon coming by, I didn't see it. So a very weak light doesn't mean a small disturbance.
So now he's just saying, if I turn down the light, I can turn down the number of baseballs I'm throwing at the electrons, and now I've got the weakest influence possible because very few baseballs hit the electron. But the point is you can't make anything smaller than a baseball. So you're always hitting it with a baseball. So you're always hitting an egg with a baseball. So you're always going to break the egg. So you can't evade breaking the egg. If you interact, you're going to break the egg. If you don't interact, the egg goes through, you don't change the egg. And that's all the argument is. And they never did the experiment. And this is all just speculation about what would happen if we did. And so the conclusion isn't a proven conclusion. It isn't a proven outcome. And he's described it as if it is.
This means a few photons. And what happens is that I have to invent a third column. You see, you get a click over here. I say, I saw that one. That was in number 1 hole. This was behind hole number 2, then another side. I didn't see that. There wasn't enough light to give a photon at that time, so there must be a third column under didn't see.
So that's the third column is just I missed it. I didn't hit it with a baseball, so I can't know whether one was there or not because I didn't hit it with a baseball, so I can't know.
And when the light is very strong, there are very few in there. When the light is very weak, most of them end in there. So that there are 3 columns, this one, and sometimes in here. You can guess what happens. The ones I do see are the...
Okay, so again, he's saying it as if he did do it. He did see this experiment. The experiment was never done. The outcome was never confirmed. It's just what he says will happen. That's all this is. This is just Richard Feynman telling us what reality is, not demonstrating it, not basing it on science, just making it up and declaring it.
Distributed this way. The ones I didn't see are distributed that way. And as I
So he's just speculating that if I don't affect it, it does what it's supposed to do, which is reconstruct a photon. So, but he just made it all up. This isn't science. This is just what Richard Feynman sees in his imagination.
turn the light weaker and weaker, what I see less and less of them, with greater and greater fraction are not seen, and the actual curve in any case is a sum of a mixture of this, and as the light gets weaker, so that fewer and fewer see it, gets more and more like that in a continuous fashion. So, in this case, if the electrons are not seen and nothing bounced off the light under those circumstances, you get this complicated pattern. For those electrons which were not seen, the ones in the column didn't see are exactly distributed.
So this is, creating the argumentation to be consistent with the 1930s invention of some idea of superposition, of the fact that photons are in some sort of magical state and that you change their state by interaction, by looking at them, that somehow looking at them changes the reality. And now that's been abused by the real lefty loop-de-doers into a theory that justifies some sort of like reality is only what consciousness has to make things real. They're not real until a consciousness perceives it, or some sort of crap like that, which inspired Einstein to say, does the moon disappear when I'm not looking at it? And then created Schrödinger cat mockery, where the intent was to mock how silly this all is. And they've turned all of that into some sort of proof rather than demonstrating how weak and silly this physics is. So this is he's creating a structure to support the nonsense of superposition, of somehow the photon isn't in any place, it's going everywhere. And it's not until I interact with it that it's forced to become something. So it's not until it hits the screen did it know it was heading for the screen. That kind of wooey bullshit.
Complicated way, and the other 2 columns are in these 2 ways here. Now, you say, I got another way to measure which hole it goes to. And I'm sorry I haven't got enough time to discuss a large number of different inventions that you might have to find out which hole the electron went through and what happens in each case. It always turns out, however, that it's impossible to arrange...
So he says it. It's impossible. He thought of everything. They thought of everything. There's no possible way. It can't be any other way than what I'm describing because we thought of everything. That's like saying, I heard every sound in the universe. Don't tell me, I know what every sound is, and there's no sound that goes bop, 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 bop. Okay? I've proven it. There's no bop, 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 bop in the universe because I listen to every possible sound. What? That's good science? He's a good science teacher? Come on.
...change the light in any way so that you can tell through which hole the thing is going.
So again, it doesn't go through a hole. It interacts with a surface. That's the first thing they should know. That's Young's drawing not working should demonstrate to them, okay, this is about surfaces. So the first thing I should establish, this isn't going through a hole. This is going next to a surface. That's the deciding factor. going next to the surface is what decides whether you're going to be a fringe photon or whether you're not going to be a fringe photon. That's what's going to decide. That's clear, that's provable. The mathematics itself proves that.
Without disturbing the pattern of arrival of the electrons from this form to this form, without destroying the interference. And not only light, but anything else. You use neutrinos, you use anything.
So another just bold step into, I just made all this crap up too, so I'll pile on some more experimental evidence that doesn't exist. So just bullshit.
Principle, it's impossible to do it. You can, if you want, invent a way to tell which hole the electron's going through. Then it turns out it's going.
So again, it just isn't a fact. They say they've done this with 50 atoms, a clump of 50 atoms, and put it through and gotten the pattern. Now 50 atoms you could shoot a photon at. The momentum of 50 atoms is rather substantial, and you're not going to affect it very much by hitting it with a single photonic piece of energy. So you could identify what slit it went through. They haven't done it. So the very experiment they claimed they did, they never did. And now that they can actually do it because it is theoretically possible, they haven't done it. Yeah. That's where your bullshit alert should. That sounds like bullshit. Just like never repeating the Eddington experiment sounds like bullshit. 400 times better resolution in space. 400 times, not 4, not 40. 400 times easier to see. And they never did it.
One or the other. But if you try to make that instrument so that at the same time it doesn't disturb the motion of the electron, then what happens is you get back, you can't tell anymore which one it goes through, and you get this. If you can't tell.
So he just said, that the real problem with electrons is, they're really delicate. But a buckyball, as they call it, a big clump of carbon, isn't so susceptible to being deflected by a photon. So it will survive detection. So you don't have the same excuse. So go do it.
How do you get this? Heisenberg noticed when he discovered the laws of quantum.
So I understand that this is all this is about, right? Is that somebody makes all these declarations made in the 1930s are now facts. The Heisenberg, whatever, isn't just a principle or some other kind of thing. They've turned it into a law. They are physically telling you that the smallest things in the universe, the things we can't see, are doing all kinds of wacky musical chair things. I mean, they're doing all kinds of silly magical things. They have ESP, they have all kinds of things. And isn't that just too coincidental? The one part of the universe we actually can't see, they say all of the secret behavior happens in that place, just in that room. None of it happens out here where we can see it. It just happens in that little place we can't see. That seems a little convenient, right?
Mechanics, that the new laws of nature that he discovered could only be consistent if there was some.
So again, he called it the new laws of nature. There's no new law here that was ever established by evidence. So not a good trial. This was conviction in a kangaroo court. Physics is a kangaroo court of truth.
Basic limitation to our experimental abilities that had not been previously recognized. In other words, you can't experimentally be as delicate as you wish. And he proposed his uncertainty principle, which stated in terms of our experiment is the following. He stated it in another way, but they're exactly equivalent. You can get from one to the other, but unfortunately I haven't time to explain that.
Yes, well, and let's just understand. So Einstein and Schrodinger really didn't like anything about Heisenberg. So this wasn't just some sort of, oh yeah, everybody gets it. No, everybody didn't get it, and they really shouldn't have gotten it. Because it is kind of just a wooey religious idea that somehow electrons don't know where they are and photons don't, and nothing knows where it is until it hits something else to tell it, oh, that's where I am? Wow, I didn't know I was heading here. I didn't know I was going to grandmother's house. I thought I was on some other road. I was on every other road in the universe, and I just happened to hit this location as an outcome first. And so now I'm stuck being here. I mean, it's that kind of just silly.
But in our experiment, his uncertainty principle would be stated in this manner. It is impossible to design any apparatus whatsoever to determine which hole the electron passes. And we want to proceed.
So let's understand that all we would need to do is aim them. And if we can aim them and get the same outcome, that is, I can shoot a laser, at one of the surfaces, and I can shoot a laser at the other surface at the same time, and then I end up with a pattern. There's lots of ways we can get around this Heisenberg crap by merely establishing that I already know where the photon's going because I aimed it. So I've already narrowed its possibilities. I've already de-entangled it. I've de-superimposed it because I am quite certain, just like when I aim a gun, I'm quite certain the bullet goes this way. There's no expectation the bullet goes behind me. There's no expectation it goes over here. I know which way the gun is pointed. The bullet's going to go there. There is no uncertainty. So all we have to do is aim them through a slit, and then we'll know exactly what slit they went through. Then do that and prove your point. Do that and prove there's no pattern.
In determining which hole the electron passes, through which hole the electron, which can determine through which hole the electron passes. That will not at the same time disturb the electron enough to destroy the interference pattern. And no one has found a way around this. And I'm sure you're all itching with invention.
So again, there sort of is a way now with modern technology. So this is back in Feynman's day. They didn't have really great lasers or any of that kind of crap. So there's no way of, where you could say, yes, if I can make a fine enough laser, I can make a laser smaller than the slits and, the beam. And I have a guarantee of where the photon's going. So now I can do the experiment knowing exactly which slit the light went through. Now the trick is creating two coherent laser beams, but whatever.
As to methods of detecting which hole the electron went through, but if each one of them is analyzed carefully, you'll find out there's something the matter with it, and that if, without disturbing the electron, you think you could do it, but it turns out there's always something the matter, and you can account for the difference in the patterns due to the disturbance of the instruments used to determine through which...
So again, it's even in it was already getting to the point where Feynman was mentioning these other objects that we could detect. And the fact is there was this theoretical point you get to where you make an object big enough, like a buckyball, like a 50 atom clump, or a 100 atom clump. I think they've even gone that high. And that you can test. That you can shine light on.
Oh, the electron comes. Now, this, therefore, is a basic characteristic of nature and tells us something about everything. If a new particle is found tomorrow, the kaon, actually it's already been found, something, give it a name, let's say a kaon, and I use kaons to interact with electrons to determine which hole the electron is going to. I already know ahead of time, I hope, enough.
I've already made up the facts, and so yes, hopefully the future will obey my edicts and be obedient, and So you just know this is all just storytelling. Right there is a giveaway, right? I hope. Well, I hope it turns out the way I've made it up to sound.
About the behavior of the kaon, to say that it cannot be of such a type that I could tell through which hole the electron would go without at the same time producing a disturbance on the electron that changed the pattern from here to here. So that the uncertainty principle is used as a general principle to guess ahead at many of the characteristics of unknown objects. They are limited in their character. Well then, let's go back. What about this proposition A? So let's go either do one over the other, or not. Well, physicists have a convention, a way of avoiding the pitfalls which exist, and they make their game, their rules of thinking as follows. That if you have an apparatus which is capable of telling which hole the electron goes through, and you can have such apparati.
No, you can't. So he already just pointed out you can't. You can't have any such apparati. So he just pointed it out. I can't create a small enough photon. I certainly can't ever see a photon. I mean, that's just way too impossible. So I can have such apparati. No, you can't. And you just admitted it earlier.
Then one can say that it either goes through one hole or the other. And does. When you look, it always is going through one hole.
All right, so when you look, you never did the looking experiments, no theoretical possibility of looking, so it never was done. So when he says when you look, it goes through one hole or the other. It never was done. We've never looked, blah, blah, blah.
When you look. But when you do not try to determine, or you have no disturbance, no apparatus there to determine through which hole the thing goes, under those circumstances, you cannot say that it either goes through one hole or the other. You can always say it, provided you stop thinking immediately and don't make any deduction from it.
Right. So I mean, the problem is right. You know, the fact is that there's a conundrum here, in the sense that single photons can't make the pattern. Single contributions from one slit or the other slit can't make the pattern. The contributions have to come from the different surfaces. You have to have contributions. In the case of the double slit, you have to have a contribution from all four surfaces. All four surfaces have to be sending information. And that's the part they're missing. That obviously, because of that fact, what's going to the surface has to be something more than just photons. There has to be some other thing that's making the photons. There's something more elemental is actually going to the surfaces, and the photon is a byproduct of what the surfaces are sending.
We prefer not to say it, rather than to stop thinking at the moment. In other words, when we don't look, we can't say through which hole it's going, but if you try to look to see, you'll find it always goes through one hole or the other. Still, to conclude that it goes either through one hole or the other when you're not looking is to produce an error in prediction. And that is the logical tightrope on which we have to walk if we wish to interpret nature.
So the logical tightrope is broken by simply understanding the surfaces are the point source, and there's obvious reason to believe the photon has been broken by its interaction with the surface, and that all you're doing is breaking photons and then remaking them at the surface. You're putting them back in phase. They're either in phase or out of phase at the target. That's how they can hit the target. They hit the target as either in phase, going out of phase, or going in phase. So there's a 50-50 chance they'll be in the going in phase side or the going out of phase side. And that's why you have essentially a 50-50 pattern of dark and light, because where it's light, they're going in phase. Where it's dark, they're out of phase. And it's that simple.
This proposition that I'm talking about is more general. It's not just for two holes. It's a general proposition reads something like this, that the probability of any event in an ideal experiment, that just means that when everything is specified as well as it can be, the probability of an event is the square of something, which I call A here, is called the probability amplitude. And
here we just have two outcomes, right? So we have two possibilities, in phase, out of phase. That's the landing result. And all he's really saying is I'm going to make two vectors out of that. Two vectors that'll say the probability. Now if the vector is 100% and 100%, then I have a straight line, I make a square, and the probability is 100% because the square is as big as the two lines put together. But if the lines have any turn in them, okay, here's the probability of 1, and 90%, let's say, on a clock, 90%. And the other one's only 10% on the clock. Well, now my line is only this line. My square is much smaller, and that's my probability of being a in-phase photon. And the 20% on the other side would be the out-of-phase photon. So it's just probability math. It's just statistics turned into, in a sense, into geometry and vectors. So you're just using vectors to decide probabilities.
And when an event can occur in several alternative ways, the probability amplitude.
So if you're adding one, like if you have, if it could be photon on, I mean, it could be light on, light off, and then gray. You know, so you have three choices. Then all you're doing really then is just saying three lines. And you're doing the same thing. Line 1 goes this way, line 2 goes that way, line 3 goes that way, then you draw your line and you make your square.
Because A number is the sum of the A's for each of the various alternatives. And finally, if an experiment is performed which is capable of determining which alternative is taken, the probability of the event is the sum of the probabilities for each alternative. That is, you lose the interference.
So, all it's really just saying it has to add up to 100, and you're always going to be stuck that if you just have one possibility, well, then you're guaranteed. You have two possibilities, then you have a percentage. And three, the percentage, and the odds are the more possibilities you have, the more bent lines you have, and the more shortened your line of possibilities is going to be.
Now, the question is, how does it really work? What machinery is actually producing this thing? Well, nobody knows any machinery.
So nobody knows. I don't know. What does that ever mean? In any context, when somebody says nobody knows, implying that nobody can know, nobody could figure it out, nobody can, nobody did. What does that all mean as a statement? The real statement is, we're not complete. That's what he ought to be saying. Well, we haven't completed the task. We don't have all the puzzle pieces. We can't tell you the answer because we don't know it. And that's what he should be saying. We don't know it because we can't know it, or we don't know it because we haven't put together enough pieces to see the new piece that'll fit.
Nobody can give you a deeper explanation of this phenomenon than I have given. That is.
All right, so I would argue that somebody could have. It's kind of sad that nobody did, because somebody could have explained to you that the original Young drawing of 200 years was inaccurate. That Young never even saw the real double slit pattern, in that sense that his viewing mechanism was so crude he didn't see the two patterns in the double slit pattern. The math that figured it out, that there was 4 point sources, came much later, and that's the math that actually works on any slit. So there's math that's old, okay, that was engineered for the single slit, and then they attempted to modify that single slit math into double slit math, and it got a little messy because it doesn't do to the two patterns. And then they fell on a mathematics that works not only for one slit, but two slits, or 10 slits, or 100 slits. And that's the only math that matters. And that math explicitly understands the surfaces are the point sources. And the distances are there's always a distance between the surfaces. And all those distances have to be accounted for in your final result. So that's why the real math uses an integral, because it has to calculate the combination of surface 1 with surface 2, surface 1 with surface 3, surface 1 with surface 4. So it has to account for all of those combinations. And by accounting for all of the combinations, it can create both. The more complex pattern arises out of acknowledging that the double slit experiment isn't the two wave experiment. It isn't the two slit, two particle experiment. Two particles won't explain it. Two wavelets won't explain it. 4 does. You have to use 4 superimposed little wavelets if you're going to use waves. You have to use 4 waves to get the right answer. And obviously 4 waves in ludicrous positions. So obviously it is not wave mechanics. It can clearly be understood as scatter mechanics. The surfaces are scattering the elements of the photon, and you are either reconstructing the phase or not reconstructing the phase, and that's why you have light and dark areas.
A description of it. They can give you a wider explanation in the sense that they can do more examples to show how it's impossible to tell which hole it goes through, and at the same time
I don't know what would have to do that, because there are no examples. So all they have to say is there's no examples of measuring which slit it went through, so let's just forget about playing that silly game.
Not destroy the interference pattern. They can give a wider class of experiments than just the two-slit interference experiment and so on, but it's just repeating the same thing to drive it in.
So it's all not a repeat. The single slit is different than the double slit. The distinctions are important. Feynman's ignoring all of them. So They not, it is a hugely, you're getting so much closer to the truth when you acknowledge surfaces are causing the fringe pattern. So once you establish that as a truth, then you have a much better, much clearer view of what the possibilities are. And Feynman hasn't even gotten there yet. He hasn't even acknowledged what is a fact, that the Young experiment was bad geometry, and that you have to improve that geometry to get the right answer.
It's not any deeper, it's only wider. The mathematics can be made more precise. You could mention that they're complex.
So again, the mathematics is so simple that you can't get any more precision out of it. To decide phase, you're just saying length. Okay, so you're just creating lines, and you're saying, well, these two lines are the same length, and then this thing hits here as this length. But if I put two batteries together over here, then this will be two battery lengths, and this will be one battery length, and they'll land at the same location. So the sequence would be back in phase if I can create a double wavelength path length. So if the path lengths can be increments of a battery length, I can create things in phase and out of phase. I mean, that's really simple math. I mean, frankly, really, really simple. So you can't do anything to fix the geometry. The geometry of phase is just about how many elements did you make the path out of. That's it. How many 10 feet increments are in the path? That's all you're looking for. And where are there places where 2 lengths equals 3 lengths from another location, or 2 lengths equals 10 lengths from another, that's all you're looking for.
Numbers instead of real numbers, and a couple of other minor points which have nothing to do with the main idea, and the deep mystery.
So again, he just keeps promoting the idea that we thought about it, there's no answer, you have to believe in the woo. You have to believe there's a random God screwing with the universe.
Is what I described. And no one can go any deeper today, but only wider.
So again, just sort of saying that nobody has any better theory than mine. When, did you really sample all the other theories? I don't think you did.
Now, I mentioned probabilities in this calculation. What we're calculating here, this curve, is the probability.
I mean, to be fair, the critiques are limited. I mean, Einstein made some critiques, but they're not very detailed and not very complete either. So that's the unfortunate part. That the truth is that nobody was suggesting a better idea. That's just, until, I showed up. Got it right. I'm giving you the right answer. That's how it's going to turn out. I'm just letting you know. That's how it's going to turn out in the end. Everything I'm telling you is correct, okay, what the photon really is and how this works. Because it's a complete answer. It does solve all of the conundrums.
Of arrival of an electron. The question is there any way to determine where it really arrives? We are not averse to using the theory of probability, that is calculating odds, when a situation is very complicated. You throw up a die and it spins so many times. And the air with the various resistance and atoms and all this complicated business that we're perfectly willing to allow, that we don't know enough details, and so we calculate the odds that the thing will come this way or that way.
Right. We just do a cheap generalization but we do know in theory that it was determined at the initiation of the experiment, that the outcome was determined by the initial trajectory and momentum. And so it was already decided when it left what was going to happen, because the rest of the mechanics is stable and solid and inevitable and all that kind of crap. So the outcome is not being wooed with. There is no magic force. There is no magic turn the dice a certain, the dice just turns for no reason. It has to be acted on by physical, mechanical, elemental atoms and molecules and electrons and photons. All those things have to make it move. It can't move for no reason. It can't change its motion because of some magic.
But here, what we're proposing, is it not, is that there be probability all the way back at the fundamental laws. That in the fundamental laws of physics, there are odds.
So he's telling you overtly that there is no resetting up the universe in the same way. There's no mechanical causes that at any one place in the activity of a function, the electron just goes in some crooked way. It just decides. Something decided. The universe decided to make it wacky. And so it's sort of a bold claim, and the argument is there's really no evidence for it. So it's basically saying there are UFOs, and he's showing you one of these little cigar fuzzy pictures and saying, there, I've proved it. It's really bad science.
For example, suppose that I have an experiment so set up that with the light out, I get this interference situation and know this. Then I say that with the light on, I can't predict through which hole it will go. I only know that each time I look, it'll be one hole or the other. But there is no way to predict ahead of time through which hole it goes. The future, in other words, is unpredictable. It is impossible to predict in any way from any information ahead of time through which the thing...
So he's saying it's not mechanical. It's not a mechanical universe. Okay, so this again is a bunch of, talk about, the thing is here going, I shoot the bullet out of the gun and the bullet just decides to go over here instead and go, or goes in that direction or goes over there, just for no reason. Because there's something in the universe that says do that. Didn't hit anything, nothing interacted with it, it just went wooey. And his proof of that wooiness is this meager anomaly. So because of this anomaly, this unexplained phenomenon, the creation of an on-off pattern, not exactly anything very dramatic, not exactly something the universe doesn't create a lot, he says we must believe. We can't trust where you're pointing your gun. If you were in the small universe, you could never shoot straight. Be impossible. For no good reason, except it's impossible. I mean, it's extraordinary physics. It's an extraordinary explanation of reality. And it should come with something like even just ordinary evidence. And they don't even have that.
Hole the thing will go, or which hole it will be seen behind. That means that physics is kind of given up if the original purpose was, and everybody thought it was.
Okay, and everybody thought it was. See, this is another joke. So he really believes this. This is, so I'm just saying, you people who think the idea of physics is to understand the mechanics of the universe, it's not. That's not their purpose. They don't think that's what science is after, is an explanation of its function. They think what we're after is an explanation of God. Magical forces.
To know enough that in given a situation, you can predict what's going to happen next. Given the circumstances, you can predict what happens. Given the circumstances, source, for a light source, tell me which hole, behind which hole will I see the electron? You say, well, the reason you can't tell through which hole you're going to see the electron is it's determined by some very complicated things back here.
So again, he's going to mock the idea that there's no way to create any kind of mechanical mechanism that's causing the effect. Now, I've just pointed out that what they can overtly know for sure right now is the mathematics that works says the fringes are coming from events that happen on the surfaces. The surfaces are where the point sources are. That's where the change takes place. And he's basically telling you surfaces can't cause any mechanical effect that would change the behavior of a photon or an electron. And you have to know, of course a surface could cause an effect. Surfaces have lots of capacity to mess up a photon. Lots of capacity to do that. I have no reason to think it's magic because I know, surfaces have a bunch of electrons on them and lots of shit. And so, all kinds of crap could happen to a photon.
If I knew enough about that electron, it has internal wheels, internal gears, and so forth, that the fact, and that this is what determines through which hole it goes. So it's 50-50 probability because like a die, it's set sort of at random. And that if I were to have studied it carefully enough.
Well, we know it's, the whole point of you saying machine gun was to point out the fact that you're not aiming, right? And it's, you're shooting phones here, 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 here. You're hitting the surface of the slits all over the surface material. So, you're shooting photons at 100% of the 180 degrees direction. So, yes, you're scattering them everywhere. Mechanically. Fact.
If your physics is incomplete, if you get a complete enough physics, then you'll be able to predict through which hole it goes. That's the hidden variable theory, so-called. Well, that's not possible.
So he says it's not even possible. So there's no possibility that there's a variable he hasn't accounted for. And I'd argue it's so obvious the variable that you haven't accounted for is surfaces have atoms on them, and the atoms have electrons associated with them, and the photon will be plowing through a bunch of electrons. And of course, that would be a possible variable. Holy crap. So he's just selling the idea. It's not possible that it's a hidden variable.
It is not due to a lack of detailed knowledge that we cannot make the prediction, because I said that if I didn't turn on the light, I should get this interference pattern. If I have a circumstance in which I get that interference pattern, then it is impossible to analyze it in terms of saying it goes through here or here.
Right, because there has to be a contribution from both surfaces. So that part's true. The fact is, if I want to get the complex pattern and I can aim the photons, I have to aim photons in the double slit experiment at all four surfaces. If I don't shoot photons at all four surfaces and allow all four surfaces to make a contribution, I can't possibly get the complex pattern. That's the explanation for that. You can't think of this pattern being created out of single photons. Single photons don't work. And that's why every single photon experiment that's ever been done has got obvious and glaring defects in it. And as I've pointed out, the Veritasium video, the one that has 8 million or 10 million views, is a piece of crap because he's overtly admitting I have to crank the detector all the way up. I'm getting 7 error photons a second. That's how sensitive he's turned the photo detector. He's had to make it so preposterously sensitive. And the reason why he did that is because it gives him an excuse to make the experiment happen in a shorter period of time to eliminate all those extra error photons. He can't let the experiment run for a day at 7 error photons a second because the number of error photons will be gigantic. So he has to make the experiment happen much, much quicker to reduce the number of error photons. And so that's basically proving that if you're shortening the period of time you're doing the experiment, you're guaranteeing that there are photons on both surfaces at the same time. Doing the experiment quick means I have a good chance there's 2 photons in the experiment at the same time. I have no chance that there's 2 photons in the experiment at the same time if I wait a whole day to do the experiment. If I let the experiment happen over a whole day, I've guaranteed that if I'm only shooting the gun twice, 10 times. Let's say I'm only shooting the gun 10 times. It's pretty much certain that if I do 10 shots over the period of a whole day, there's a very low likelihood there's 2 shots at the same time. But if I'm doing it within 10 seconds, there's a very high likelihood that I shot the gun twice at the same time, kind of thing.
Term is so simple, mathematically a different thing than the contribution of this and this as probability. So if it were possible for you to have determined through which hole it was going to go if I had the light on, the fact that I have the light on hasn't got anything to do with it. Whatever gears there are back here that you observed, which permitted you to tell me whether it was going to go through 1 or 2, you could have observed if I had the light off. And therefore you could have told me with the light off which hole, each time an electron goes, which hole it's going to go through. But if you can do this, then that curve would have to be represented as the sum of those that go through there and those that go through there, and it ain't. And therefore, it's impossible to have any information ahead of time as to which hole it's going to go through.
So again, this is not a proof of impossibility. So I just, I'll say that. Just you can sort of understand that it really can't be a proof of impossibility because he doesn't have proof that it has to have a contribution from both slits at the same time. That's not even what he's arguing in this argument. So how else to say that? Yes, it'll be good enough for now.
When the light is out, or when the light is on, or out, in a circumstance where the experiment is set up there to produce this interference. So it is not a lack of unknown...
So I understand that, yes, the way you solve the problem is to aim the photons. If you can aim the photons, then you don't have to interfere with them, then you don't have any excuse to say you broke the pattern. So if you aim them at one surface or the other surface, then you don't have any Heisenberg law violation.
Years. A lack of internal complications that makes nature have probability in it. It seems to be in some sense intrinsic. Someone has said it this way: nature herself doesn't know which way the electron is going to go.
So again, this is a real overt argument against any kind of notion of a mechanical universe. So again, this is why it did bother Einstein, because Einstein thought it's pretty much a clock and it ticks. There's no Wooey action at a distance. There's no any of that stuff. Now, Einstein's own bent space theory is Wooey action at a distance, so I don't, it's hard to not call Einstein a bit of a hypocrite, but whatever.
A philosopher once said, "It is necessary for the very existence of science that the same conditions always produce the same result."
So he called that person a philosopher. Now, that doesn't sound like, some kind of political statement. It doesn't really sound like a philosophical statement. It sounds kind of like a scientific statement, basically saying that if I have three things in some known three-dimensional space, right, and they're in that space, that what they will do, if everything else stays the same, is going to be exactly the same. I put them in the same location with the same conditions, the outcome's going to be the same. So if and our whole computer, modern technology world we live in is so dependent on everything doing this so reliably. I mean, trillions of little interactions inside the computer creating this video. And they're all so frickin' precise. Every little thing is happening exactly as it's supposed to happen, and blah, 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 blah. And it's even compensated for whatever little tiny errors that could be created in there. But it's insanely diligent and consistent. And he's arguing for some universe where, no, the electrons are just, completely wacky. It really doesn't fit in the reality. It really doesn't fit that everything could be so precise if the elemental functions weren't also precise.
Well, they don't. You set up the electrons in any way. You set up the circumstance here in the same conditions every time.
See, and that's what the audience wants to hear. They want to hear how the universe is wacky and silly. They were all ready to start applauding. Oh, good, you defeated that idiotic notion that we live in a mechanical universe. And these are physicists. These are scientists. And they're basically saying, yeah, I don't like evolution. Give me back a God story. Give me back to Jehovah and bullshit. And they're applauding. So, yeah, this isn't good.
You cannot predict behind which hole you'll see the electron.
Almost done.
They don't, and yet the science goes on in spite of him, although the same conditions don't produce the same results. That makes us unhappy that we can't predict exactly what will happen. Incidentally, you can make a circumstance.
So it isn't anything to do with that, right? I mean, it doesn't make me unhappy because I can't predict. I already knew I can't predict a lot of stuff. It's trillions of events happening on the tip of my finger. I mean, I know I can't do all this predicting crap, on that level. So that wasn't much. That's not much of a disappointment that I'll never watch Photons. Yeah, I know I'll never watch Photons. I'll never see the movie Photon exposed. That movie will never happen. So yeah, that's not a big disappointment. What's the big disappointment is that you're arguing essentially let's all go back to religion, and that's the disappointing part.
Very dangerous and serious, and man must know and still can't predict. For instance, we could cook up, I know we'd rather not, but we could cook up a scheme by which we arrange photocells so that if it see the electron, one electron is going to go through. If we see it behind hole number one, we set off the...
This is slightly creepy that he would go through this, right? This guy was there making the bomb. He knows what the bomb did. You know, and he knows the politics of that bomb going off. And here he is making nuclear bomb jokes. That's just a little bit creepy. Like, wow, you really don't get it, do you? I mean, you really don't get it at all.
Atomic bomb and start World War III. If we go see it behind hole 2, we have just to make peace feelers.
I mean, he could have used some other thing, like we allow Schrodinger's cat to whack its paw at a jar full of smallpox, and we infect the human race with smallpox. I mean, he could have made it something other than a nuclear fucking bomb that he helped basically burn people's skin off with and all that shit.
And delay the war a little longer. Then, the thing is that the future of man would then be dependent upon something which no amount of science can predict. Our world is the future is unpredictable.
So again, it's really not in any fundamental sense beyond the fact that yes, we can't know where every single photon is in the universe and predict what exactly is going to happen because we can't trace every single piece of energy moving in the universe. Well, duh. But he's saying we can't do it because the universe doesn't have those answers. And obviously I would say we can't do it because we don't have the technology or the separate universe to do the observating. There has to be another universe to do the observing for us to have the image of it. We have to create a camera, you know, we have to synthesize the entire universe in some other universe to be able to model the universe. And yeah, obviously we can't do that.
What is necessary for the very existence of science and so forth, and what the characteristics of nature are not to be determined by pompous preconditions. They're to be determined.
So he's the one with the pompous conditions, stating that there is no answer, there's no possibility, it can't be a hidden. We've proved it can't be something we don't know. We proved it can't be something we don't know. I mean, that's exactly pretty much what he said, which is just bullshit.
Not determined always by the material with which we work, by nature herself. We look and we see what we're going to find, what we find, and we cannot say ahead of time successfully what it's going to look like. The most reasonable possibilities turn out often not to be the situation.
So that's not really true either, right? I mean, everything seems really predictable in a lot of cases, and we just keep pretending to be surprised when outcomes end up exactly as, you know, totally predictable.
What is necessary for the very existence of science is just the ability to experiment, the honesty in reporting results. The results must be reported without somebody saying what they like.
Okay, so, you know, and he's just so guilty of, he just made up a bunch of experiments never done, you know, projected their results, all this, even got the audience to participate in, you know, mimicking the fake experiment. I mean, come on. What honesty is there here? Again, the Young drawing of the double slit pattern as a wave function is completely inaccurate. The point sources are in the wrong. Two waves would never work as an explanation. Two waves centered in the openings never mathematically worked.
The results we have had been. And finally, an important thing is the intelligence to interpret the results, but important point about this intelligence is that it should not be sure ahead of time about what must be.
Well, again, he just made a whole bunch of declarations about what must be based on experiments that never really were performed, and they're just pretty much made up. So he's trying to match conditions that he never proved to exist in the first place, and found that, oh, there's no way to match those irrational conditions. Well, of course, there's no way to match the irrational conditions, so maybe you ought to make your conditions real instead of irrational.
Now, it can be prejudiced and say that's very unlikely. I don't like that.
So he didn't say that. He didn't say, I don't like a hidden variable theory, right? He declared it impossible.
Prejudice is different.
I mean, he's talking science. He doesn't walk science.
Than absolute certainty. I don't mean absolute prejudice, just bias. But not strict bias. See, not complete prejudice. As long
I don't even know what to say, right? He's basically saying something like intuition. Well, some intuition is okay. Sometimes seems like it looks like. Sometimes blah, 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 blah. No, the whole point is you're not allowed to make up fake experiments to support your argument. That's one of the things you're not allowed to do, and you just did it.
If you're biased, it doesn't make any difference, because if the fact is true, there will be a perpetual accumulation of experiments.
No, they won't. So that's obviously what they didn't need, right? So again, the Eddington experiment never repeated. All of this two-slit analysis, no one's doing any of it. Nobody's going back to these experiments and testing them. All those air tracks in all of those universities, they're used for 5 minutes and that's it. They don't do anything with them. They don't play with them, okay, to see, to really pick apart reality.
Perpetually annoy you until they cannot be disregarded any longer. Only can be disregarded if you're absolutely sure ahead of time of some precondition that science has to have.
Right. Well, let's just understand. It's 200 years since Young, and they're still saying the Young double-slit experiment. They're still saying there wasn't something fundamentally wrong with Young's analysis when it was fundamentally wrong.
In fact, it is necessary for the very existence of science that minds exist which do not allow that nature must satisfy some preconceived conditions.
Okay, they're not preconceived conditions, they're logical deductions. Until you show me the aliens, I have no good reason to believe in aliens. So show me. And you're just saying I can't show you because my God only works in these mysterious corners. And so you're just using a lame excuse to say I'm not obligated to show you. I'll just make proclamations about what my God is doing. Because there is now and then something happens. Once in a while humans are born with a tail. Shall we give it that as superstitious reasoning, or shall we understand that, oh yeah, well it's because genetic code, a piece gets broken, and there's lots of archaic crap still in our genetic code, and so it just ends up reading the archaic bit instead of the new bit, and so you end up with a tail. Simple explanation. It is a real explanation. You don't sit there and say there's no explanation. I mean, God did it. No, God didn't do it.
Like those of our philosophy.
So again, he's insulting whatever philosophy. The philosophy stating that, yes, it is from every appearance, every piece of really good hard evidence says it really is a three-dimensional universe full of stuff moving in 3 dimensions, material objects with momentum moving in those 3 dimensions, and that would include the energy like photons, and that there are conditions, and if I change the conditions, I change the outcome. That's every bit of evidence indicates that's a very good perceptual statement. It's a very good likely to be a fact statement. And he's claiming that somehow we have good reason to doubt that because of this experiment. No, you don't. All right. So anyway, that's enough said and such. So this has been a DraftScience video presentation and such. Thank you very much.